Hello everyone, once again another deck profile on an upgraded deck from set 6 of Divines, which is Dragonic Kaiser Vermillion, this time to the blood, because I really like Vermillion's design ever since it was first introduced, especially from the original series when I first played it, and now he's evolved to the blood, which is just bringing back some nostalgia. Played the blood from V, and the V one was definitely interesting, although now with the blood returning once again for D series, I have to say, not as interesting, but still a pretty good upgrade to the original one. And I'm also going to be very honest, I was expecting this at Divine Set 9 to mimic the original Knights and Dragons, but they brought this sooner than expected, so I guess sooner the better. But anyway, how this deck functions? Well, you basically just use Vermillion to multi-attack your opponent's rear guards, and I don't mean by multi-attacking and I mean by striking down multiple units at one attack. That's basically Vermillion's playstyle, but adding that with Narukami, which focuses on binding your opponent's rear guards, which can actually be better or worse depending on certain matchups, but usually better because your opponent has more drop zone recursion than bind. So it's really just depending on the matchup. But when Vermillion was first introduced, it had some issues where if your opponent does not have a board for one, it couldn't really exactly do much. Luckily, you do have some extra bonuses when your opponent doesn't have a board. And even now, it's kind of the same thing, but a little bit better because you do have some extra stuff. And especially extra multi-attack in consistency wise. But anyway, with all that out of the way, let's just begin with the deck profile with, of course, the Rye deck. So first off, your starter, Spark Kid Dragoon, since it's Narukami, which we go to Red River Dragoon, where when your Grade 2 Narukami rides on top of it, search your deck for one Eternal Thunderbolt, aka the attack name card for Vermillion, and add it to your hand. Although the anime called it Vermillion Thunderbolt instead of Eternal Thunderbolt, but they did eventually rename it, which went to the manga version with Eternal Thunderbolt. In which the second skill, which if you do decide to run more copies, where when it boosts, if you have at least a Grade 3 Vanguard Narukami, counterblast 1 to choose one of your opponent's backward rear guards and bind it, but if you fail to bind, you soul charge 2. Back when Narukami uses a bit of soul with this deck, but now you don't really need it, so you just use it for the right deck skill. In which we go to Thunderstorm Dragoon, where when you ride a Grade 3 Narukami on top of it, look at top 7 cards from your deck for one Eternal Thunderbolt or one Narukami from among them, and add it to your hand. Kind of similar to the Aqua Force one, I must say. But the second skill is placed on rear guard. If your Vanguard's Narukami, you can soul charge 1 and plus 5k. You don't really need this anymore for that rear guard skill, so you just use it for the right deck. Now we go to Dragonic Kaiser Vermillion the Blood, which we are, yes, indeed, skipping the evolution once again, which can actually be explained without talking about original Vermillion, but let's just go over original Vermillion from the main deck before going to the blood. So original Vermillion is act once per turn, counterblast 1, choose 2 Narukami units, and it gets plus 5k power, and then you choose 2 of your opponent's rear guards, and you can attack them both at the same time along with the Vanguard. So basically striking down 3 units at the same time, which is very huge in some cases because this actually makes things easier for attack hit. And that's a strong point about this deck, is that attack hit is actually so much easier because of the multi-attack units. Now, you just need to have a target to begin with, so if you don't have a target, it might suck. And the second skill of original Vermillion is that once per turn at the end while it attacked, and you played an order card this turn, aka Eternal Thunderbolt, you can discard 1 card to strike your opponent's Vanguard 1 damage if your opponent, of course, has 4 or less damage. So that's an added new skill that Vermillion never had from the original or even from V, but it is technically an improvement to basically the original and V, because it's less counterblast heavy and you choose your targets. Now we go to the blood, where if you have the original Vermillion soul, it gets plus 5k. But if your opponent's Vanguard is at least Grade 3, your whole front row gets the 5k and itself gets a crit. It feels like the original because the original, the blood, just gets plus 5k and 1 crit. And in a way, it's basically Venus Lucier, because Venus Lucier, if you have the original, it does the exact same thing, funny enough. But the second skill kind of does the same exact thing as the original Vermillion here, because it's an Axe Soul Blast 1, and then you can choose 2 of your opponent's units to attack it along with the Vanguard. So basically, the 5k power buff and the multi-attacking part is now separate skills, which can be better or worse, but in a way better because the extra power buff is free, and you give it to the whole front row, which is 3 units instead of just 2. And it gets a crit on top of it, so that's also a plus. And another thing is soul. Because the deck doesn't use as much soul as it used to, although at the same time still uses quite a lot of soul just because of 1 card, you still regain soul pretty fast, so the soul blasting part isn't too bad. And trading that soul blast over a counter blast is actually very huge because now you have a lot of counter blast to spare. So that is the improvement part. But the third skill is exactly the same as the original Vermillion here, where it does the Thunder Strike on your opponent at the end of battle attack. If you play a normal order, discard a card to Thunder Strike your opponent 1 damage. So basically, it's kind of the same as the original, but just with few tweaks. The extra crit does make a difference, and the extra power buff on the 1 extra unit does make a difference, but I say this is a little bit boring, despite the bit of the improvement. Now, the artwork-wise still looks cool. The other thing I'm a little bit baffled about is that they didn't take the V-Series route, where you can hurt yourself 1 damage by getting yourself an extra drive check. The overcharge part with the extra drive check was pretty awesome and interesting, and it's basically a risky maneuver, which is something I really like from the V Blood. So I really wish that they kind of took that route instead of this boring route where it was kind of like the original series where it's just a few tweaks of a buff. But what we got is what we got, and I would say it's partially better just because of the cost difference and the extra power buff. And now to the main deck. Since we are skipping the cross ride, we're going to Persona riding immediately. And then the most important card that you must run is the Eternal Thunderbolt. The cool thing about this card is that you can even play it from the drop zone, but you just have to bind it. Now, it gives the Vermillion the skill where any card that it retired gets bound instead. Because all the units get retired from the attack hits, it kind of makes weird, awkward interactions with some of your cards actually need stuff bound instead. So changing it to bind, especially in mid-battle, is just very huge. Especially for one in particular card. But the other part is that if your opponent has no rear guards, your whole front row gets us 5k instead. So if you have no targets plus 5k, so it does punishes your opponent a bit, but at the same time, it is a huge hindrance that if your opponent has no rear guards because you actually need those attack targets to actually do stuff. But the new support does help out a bit with some of this, so it's not entirely too bad, especially with the 5k power buff and the crit. But you still just have to run 4 of these because it is your main card of the deck that makes everything kind of work. And then to the support, first off, the Rocket Core Hammer Dragon. This is one of your promos that got reprinted, and it's actually one of the consistency cards because when this card attacks, if you play normal order this turn, aka Eternal Thunderbolt, plus 5k into the end of the battle, and then at the end of the battle, you can counterblast 1, draw a card, and bind this unit. Keep in mind about the bind. That bind is actually very huge because it interacts with another card. But the second skill makes it even better because in the bind zone, if you played a normal order this turn and it's the start of the battle, you can superior call this card if you do not have another copy. Yes, a free superior call attacker, pretty nice. You just must run this. And now, to the grade 2s, which we start off with the one to skip the cross ride with, which is Kashin. So, it's treated as Narukami. Yep, once again, another one of these. So, on place from hand to rear guard, look at top 7 cards of your deck to search for 1 Vermillion or Eternal Thunderbolt from among them and add to your hand. But if you search a card, you choose a card from your hand to either discard or put to soul. Does 2 things. Interacts with one of the cards that will go from the drop zone, or put the Vermillion Soul, which aka Vermillion Soul is just basically skipping cross ride. So that itself is pretty huge. But the second skill makes it even better because it interacts with certain cards where when this card attacks and your Vanguard is Vermillion, also being Narukami, you can counterblast 1 plus 10k, and at the end of battle, bind this unit. Being a 20k attacker on its own, pretty nice. The binding itself is not as much of a punishment because it's going to interact with another card, especially since it's mid-battle. So you just must run 4 just because it skips your cross ride and it's a searcher and does a lot of stuff. And then to another new grade 2, which is the Bellicosty Dragon. It's a Kagero unit, but it's a generic encounter for D-Series. So when placed on rearguard, you can energy blast 3 to put a card from your hand to soul to draw 2 cards. It's basically Nemen just for Dragon Empire for the non-stride decks. And the second skill is that when your Vanguard attacks plus 5k, at most it will only be gain 5k because this is not Overlord. If it was Overlord, it'll be gain the 5k twice. But the extra draw 2 is pretty nice, especially since the deck doesn't really even use energy at all. And having another way to put the Vermillion Soul is just pretty nice as well. Especially in comparison to Maelstrom, for example, it doesn't have an alternate card to put the original Maelstrom to Soul. Although that one does have the plus side of having it on rearguard. But having more ways just to put in Soul is just helpful. So that's it for the grade 2 lineup. To the grade 1 lineup, the card that interacts with most of your stuff and it's your multi-attack enabler is your Rising Phoenix. So from the drop zone, when a unit is bound, you can Soul Blast 1 to Superior Call this card. Yes, it will be only 8k on the Superior Call on its own, but on top of other skills, it's going to get some extra power, aka like the blood. And this is what I mean that Battle Phase binding is very important and your new support cards is very helpful because it binds itself and then this card can trigger to Superior Call itself. Comparing to having just using Vermillion to attack and bind, because sometimes your opponent won't even have rear guards. And this is what I mean about one little weakness where if your opponent has no rear guards, you have nothing to bind. So your new cards literally add the consistency for this, and this is what I also mean that it's discard fodder. So that's why you must run 4 of these because it's your literal multi-attack engine. And the second skill helps it out as well because you can retire to choose one of your units and give it plus 5k. So it sets us up to the drop zone as well, which is also very nice. But it's your multi-attack engine, so you just have to run 4, especially with now the self-binding that you got. It's now more consistent than ever. And then another card that was very helpful that was in set 3 is the Spark Spike Dragon. So it's treated as Narukami, very huge right there, with the second skill where if your Vanguard's Narukami, all your other rear guards in the same column as the unit gets plus 5k. And here's what I mean that you got extra power here because if you Superior Call the Rising Phoenix on top of it, it gets plus 5k. And let's not forget the previous attacking unit that also gets plus 5k. But if your Vanguard attacks hits at least 2 or more times this turn, plus 10k instead. And considering that Vermillion does multi-attacking units, that is not going to be too hard unless if your opponent actually clears up their board first. So this itself is already pretty nice, and that's why you must run 4 because it helps out with the extra power. But the second skill makes it a little better, but you're not going to use it too often because at the end of battle this unit boosts and your Vanguard attack hit 2 or more times this turn, you can Energy Blast 3 to draw. It is hard to kind of get this back sometimes, so I wouldn't recommend doing that all the time unless you really need the draw. But the extra power is just very helpful that you just must run 4 of these. And then finally, 4 PGs, because PGs. And then for the trigger lineup, OT, Restanding Vanguard is always awesome. 8 crits for the full on pressure. 3 draws. I did try out the fronts, but I found myself kind of needing pieces more that I actually prefer drawing. And then finally, 4 heals, 2 being counters. And so that's it for this deck profile on my Dragonic Kaiser Vermillion The Blood deck. What do you guys think of it? What other changes would you make? And what other cards would you recommend? Personally, I like the deck how it is. It's been working pretty well, although kind of the same as the original, just with some added tweaks. But it does add a little consistency for the multi-attack engine, aka Rising Phoenix, so there is that. But Vermillion was one of those decks that I kind of liked from the beginning with its awesome design, although over time it kind of became lackluster until there was the V version, which actually took an interesting route of self-damaging yourself because it's dying from drinking the Emperor's blood for the lore reason. Which is something I kind of wish that the D version did rather than basically just do simple improvement tweaks to the original, because I just found that a little bit boring. But evolution it is, and it does help out a bit, and other than that, it doesn't really exactly do much. It kind of operates the same exact thing, just a little bit better. But in that, there's really not much to say about this, and see y'all next time.